Erev Tov. Thank you everyone for coming. So nice to see so many people here, including a lot of faces that are even familiar to me. My name's David. I'm Jeremy's younger brother. And I see many people I know who went to MIT with him, who have been through his Israel journey with him. And it's a very nice audience to commemorate 10 years since his passing. And I want to look back to 9 years ago when we had a memorial lecture the first year after Jeremy passed. And it was a very nice event. Natan Sharansky spoke. And my father was supposed to attend the event, but something came up at the last minute, health-wise, and so he wasn't able to attend. And so my father gave me his speech to present for him, or his talk. And those of you who remember my father took great pains and great care over these kinds of presentations. And he made it very clear that I had to read exactly what he wrote literally, no changes. And my father's discussion of my brother's life was beautiful. It talked about my brother's deep love of chemistry, which he shared with my father, his love of science and philosophy. My father even brought in biblical references and poetry references. And of course, he had to include a joke. When my father and my brother were together, there was always a joke. And I can't really repeat the joke because it was a little bit on the racy side. But I will say this. The joke involved a visiting dignitary to Jerusalem, some helicopters, my father thinking he was being chased by the helicopters, and when I delivered the punchline, my then 11-year-old daughter said in her best stage whisper to her mother, "Mom, what's a virgin?" And I think, that sort of summed up my father's humor with my brother and my brother's humor generally. And I wanted to talk for just a minute, if there's one word that comes to mind when I think about my brother, it's the word foundation. And the reason I use the word foundation is that Jeremy really was foundational for so many people in his life. And when we look back at his memory, and we think about the foundation that he laid for all of us, it's really a blessing. I know for myself, it started really as basic a foundation as there could be. He taught me to read. During the summer of 1969, when I was 4 years old and he was 8, he would bring home the sports page every day and teach me to read by looking at the box score for the New York Mets games. And that was my foundation for reading. It also was my foundation for being a Mets fan, and I still blame him for that to this day. When I look at my family, each of my daughters had a trip to Israel during their first grade year. And my brother made that trip so special for them. It really was foundational in their journey as Jewish people and in their connection to Israel. So much so that my younger daughter is here right now on a gap year living in Tel Aviv. When I think about the foundation that Jeremy laid for Lisa and the boys and all the people who knew him, it really was the hallmark of his essence as a person, that he wanted to know you, he wanted to understand you, he wanted to meet you where you were and find out how to connect with you. And it really is a pleasure to see all the people in this room who we can look back after 10 years since Jeremy's passed and see the foundation that he laid in all of us. Thank you.
Is this working? Ooh. Okay. So first of all, again, thank you everybody for coming. When I was standing at the door, people were walking in. I had like the accent group and then the MIT group and then from the different Shabbat tables that we've had and just people from our lives both before we were married and after. And so thank you everybody for really joining us. For my 4th birthday, I got a red tricycle. It had little tassels on the handlebars, little basket in front, bell to ring, and I love that tricycle. But I was born in the winter, so when I first started riding my tricycle, I was inside the house. Spring came, and I was running out the door to test my wheels and ride outside, except that I discovered that our driveway was made of gravel. So I couldn't go fast, and we had a lot of grass, and I couldn't go fast in the grass, and I was really frustrated. My grandparents shared a yard with us, and along the side of my grandparents' house was a sidewalk that was made of cement and was very smooth. So naturally, I was very excited. But along the sidewalk was also a very large tree with roots that pushed up part of the sidewalk. And so the sidewalk had this little ramp on it. Now, I was 4 years old, and I was very excited to have my tricycle outside, and I, more than 1,000 times, sped and rode on that sidewalk and went up that ramp and forced myself in different directions to fly. This was my first experience, like physically feeling something that was like wild. And I loved the feeling of the wind in my hair. And I loved the feeling of that I could, in each direction, gear how I was going to land and how I was very oftentimes falling. But that sensation of going fast and not knowing how I was going to land and where I was going to land was totally my thing. An hour and a half away from where I was Jeremy. He was 5. He was not on a tricycle going wild. He was sitting in the kitchen playing with Fisher Technics. I'm sure many people know what Fisher Technics are, but it's Lego that you like build, but you don't just build it. Like you have to make a plan and you have to analyze and think about how you want your building to be, and it was a whole process. So here was I on the wild tricycle, and Jeremy being patient, analytical, and as many of you know from MIT, slowly building and designing his thing. Jump ahead 25 years, and Jeremy and I meet. And I'd say on our first date, and many of you know this, 15 minutes into our first date, I knew he was the guy. But we dated for 6 months, went to America, met each other's families, got engaged. And when we came back, we were at a Shabbat dinner, and somebody asked, oh, how did you guys meet? And, you know, how did it come about? And casually talking, and Jeremy says, oh, yeah, I had a list. Oh. Okay. I didn't know about the list. He doesn't go into the list thing, and I'm thinking to myself, okay, let's hope that 8 out of the 10 I meet. He tells me there's 10 people. 8 out of the 10 I meet. We leave the dinner, and we're casually walking along. He's walking me home. I said, Jeremy, I didn't know there was a list. You had 10 things you were looking for. How many of the 10 do I meet? And he says, 2. Exactly. I'm like, okay. 10 minus 2, that's not so good. And I looked at him like, Jeremy, you're married. How can it be that you're marrying somebody that only meets 2 out of the 10 things that were on your list of what you were looking for in a wife? And he says to me, Lisa, I never thought of putting wild, warm, sweet, and loving on the list. I'm like, oh. 4. 2 and 4, 6. Okay, it's not quite 8, but at least it's more than 50%. Anyway, 19 and a half years we were married, and the following happened. A little bit of Lisa's wild and extrovert rubbed off on Jeremy, and a little bit of Jeremy's analytical, patient approach to life rubbed off on Lisa. And we could see this in a lot of different ways in our lives. And one example that I would love to give is there was a Friday night that we had. It was before he got really sick. Our neighbors and dear friends, the Blasses, went away for a weekend, and they left all 4 of their kids at home and said, they're coming to eat by you. I'm like, okay, great. So we had around our table, our boys brought some of their friends, and we had the Blast kids, and it was basically Jeremy at the head of the table, and Jeremy had 2 places at the dining room table. During the week, he sat with his back to the kitchen with all of his computer and his work stuff, and then Friday, his Parsha sheets and his Tanakh came to the head of the table for the Friday night meal. And this is where Jeremy became more of an extrovert, because Jeremy, as many of you know by being at our Shabbat table, ran an amazing Dvar Torah over Shabbat. And so at this meal, we had 10 teenagers, maybe even more, junior high school level, from all different high schools of Jerusalem, and he engaged them in a 4-hour discussion on the Parsha. And he kept like pushing them, what about this, and what about that? And then the girls are arguing with them. And you could just see like how he came to life. And that's one of my favorite examples of how Jeremy kind of adapted to part of the Lisa wild extrovert and where we merged. I call this shif shuf, and shif shuf can sometimes be a negative thing, but to me, shif shuf and like the rubbing off can also be very, very positive. The reason that I'm telling you this story is because when I look at the 3 elements of what Moshe Capella is going to be speaking about in our topic for tonight, it's really all about the shif shuf. It's all about the rubbing off. Because we've got Jewish law, we've got our state that has been given to us, and we have technology and all the elements of modernism. And one of our challenges of our generation, and quite honestly of every generation of the Jewish people, is what do we do with that rubbing off? Where does that happen? How does that happen? How does that keep us in, the long-term game of the Jewish people? And what is going to define for us now in Israel that melding place and connecting place? So I'd like to invite Moshe to come up. He's going to speak for anywhere between 20 and 40 minutes and take some questions. After he's done, those that want to daven will have Mariv over here, and the rest of us will be outside.
Do I need that?
No. Do you have
So it should be off then, otherwise it's gonna have,
Oh, yeah.
there's gonna be some feedback or whatever. Okay. Okay. Thank you very much, Lisa, for this opportunity. First of all, I just want to start and say I was always very fond of Jeremy, but only now did I discover that he was a Met fan. I would have been so much fonder of him had I known this at the time. Okay. So a lot of the people here know Jeremy from way back. I met Jeremy in 1982 when he came on Aliyah. I was also a new Ola at the time. We were part of a whole gang of single American Olim, mostly Dati and overeducated. And we were here because we wanted to be at the cutting edge of Jewish history. This is where we thought Jewish history was happening. We wanted to make our Jewish commitments more real. And Jeremy was very much part of that crowd. Just to get a sense of how long ago that was, 1982 was closer to 1948 than it is to today. Okay, so anybody who was here then has been here for most of Israel's existence. So if you want to feel old, feel old. But in Jeremy's case, Jeremy came, he was an MIT grad. He had studied physics, he had studied chemistry, he knew biology, he knew computer science, he knew math. He was a science geek, like a lot of us. I say that with great fondness. And he came to contribute to Israel's prosperity. And he had no idea at the time, none of us did, the extent to which people like him were going to be contributing to Israel's prosperity, because Israel in 1982 wasn't startup nation. It wasn't even close to startup nation. It was because of people like Jeremy that Israel became startup nation. On a personal note, I remember very clearly Jeremy's big, happy smile, but there was always a note of bashfulness in that smile. And what that bashfulness said to me was that he knew more than he was letting on, because he did. He knew about a lot of things, and you could see the wheels turning when he was smiling. There was a lot going on there. In any case, Jeremy was devoted to Judaism. He was devoted to Israel. He was a real pro at technology, and I want to talk about the interaction of those three things tonight. And I just want to say one disclaimer before I start. As far as I'm concerned, tomorrow is just another Tuesday. If you think you're reading some political allusions into anything I say, I promise you're not, okay? There's going to be absolutely no hints at politics tonight. Okay, so here's my thesis. In the next generation or so, Jewish law, halakha, is going to be facing a radically new situation, and it's going to have to adapt to that radically new situation. That is to say, Judaism is at an inflection point. And the two main issues that are going to create challenges for Israel are the fact of a Jewish state and technology. Okay, now the first thing, now I just want to be clear that I'm only going to be talking about paradigm-changing issues. I'm not talking about technical problems that will be raised. We need to solve some particular, no, technical problems can always be solved. I want to talk about the big issues, okay? I'll try not to sound French. Now, the first thing I need to say is every generation thinks that it's at an inflection point, okay? So you should be very suspicious of people who say we're at an inflection point, right? The reason every generation thinks that they're at an inflection point is that the present, at any given moment, the past is known and the future is unknown. So in that sense, the future is very different than the past, right? So people imagine that all kinds of changes are going to happen that couldn't be anticipated, that there's not some clear pattern that's going to, that projects out from the past into the future. Most of the time, that's not true. There are very few inflection points in history. But let me explain to you why I believe we are now at an inflection point, and it's relevant to halakha. So first of all, as far as Jews are concerned, the enormity of the Shoah and the founding of the State of Israel within a few years of each other, just 75 years ago, it can't be exaggerated. Now, you might think, well, yeah, but that's behind us, right? I mean, the Holocaust happened, and everybody now, or most people now, were born after the Holocaust, certainly not everybody, but, and the state's been around 75 years. We already more or less understand how this works. I just want to say that that is simply not true. The effects of the Holocaust, the real deep effects, will only be felt in the future. Just to give you one example, okay, the people who would be the leaders of this generation, right, people who would now be the elders, who would be about in their upper 70s or their early 80s, those are the children who were killed in the Holocaust or were not born because of the Holocaust, okay? So bear in mind that we are still, right at this moment, an orphan generation, because the vast majority of those who would have been the leaders today are not here. But I want to talk more about the meaning of the state for the Jewish people than the meaning of the Holocaust, although the two are obviously inseparable. Okay, concomitantly, more generally, and not talking about the Jews in particular now, we're at a rare period of what I would call value malleability, okay, where values that have been long held by all societies are changing, okay? That's extremely rare. So religion is in decline, birth rates are down, homosexuality and gender fluidity are becoming accepted. Me Too is a thing, veganism is a thing, sexual norms have been sublimated as food restrictions, et cetera, okay? Now, all of this, yeah, well, we've seen it happen, right? So we kind of think, yeah, okay, yeah, that stuff happens. No, these are very, very unusual. The fact that such foundational values change at such a rate, and now I'm not commenting on whether they're good or bad, but simply the mere radicalism of so many changes happening over such a short period of time and being so widely accepted by young people in so short a period of time is extremely rare, okay? Which is just, I bring that only as another reason why I think that we are now at an inflection point. Now, technology is also at an inflection point. First of all, if you look at the big picture, if you look at prosperity, by any measure of prosperity, from ancient times until today, the graph would look something like this, completely flat until about 1800 or so, and then you get capitalism, the Industrial Revolution, et cetera, and you have exponential growth, okay, till today. Exponential growth can't keep up that long. There's not enough molecules in the universe. So clearly, at some point, this prosperity has to flatten out. But more importantly, for my purposes, technology is advancing asymptotically to some kind of a limit, okay? So, I mean, if we can break technology down, I'm borrowing from von Neumann now, if you could break technology down, basically it's about the production of more and cheaper energy, it's about the efficient communication of information, and it's about the automation of human activity. Now, all of these things there are theoretical bounds for, right? So you just can't get information transferred faster than a certain rate. You can't create energy faster than a certain rate. There are literal physical bounds to these things, and we're approaching them, okay, asymptotically. Now, all of these things can potentially lead to existential risk, either by bad actors or by good actors who insist on regulating the riskiest technology only for the good people. So we're definitely reaching a point where something could happen, okay? That's all. I say all this to simply suggest that when I say that we're at an inflection point, I'm not just saying it as kind of the standard thing that everybody says, but because there were legitimate reasons for worrying about these kind of things. Okay. Now, what I'm going to talk about now is specifically halacha, and specifically about the impact of statehood and technology and the kinds of things I was just talking about on halacha. Just to give you a sense, I'm not talking about the next 5 years, the next 10 years. I'm talking about generations. So let's call it 25 years, something like that, 25, 30, something like that. Okay. So the main point about statehood is this. The main fact about having a Jewish state is this. Judaism has always been a counterculture, okay, since the Churban, 2,000 years ago at least. Judaism is a counterculture. We have lived as a minority in the diaspora where the dominant culture was not only different than ours, but generally hostile to ours, okay? So Judaism survived as a counterculture. Even in Israel, because Israel was founded on mostly by secular socialist Zionists, halakha was and has been a counterculture, okay? But this cannot be sustained, okay? What I want to argue is that because Israel, although it is still somewhat of although halakha is still somewhat of a counterculture, what's happening is it is slowly becoming a mainstream culture. I would call it, not the mainstream culture, but a mainstream culture, not a counterculture. And in particular, it's becoming the default culture, okay? So that, yeah, if you haven't really thought about it much, well, the basics of Judaism are kind of woven in to the fabric of life over here, and somebody who's not particularly committed to any competing ideology is likely to be living a fundamentally Jewish life. Okay, now that's in process, that's going to continue, but to some extent we can already see this happening. And as a result, I want to give 3 examples of subcultures that are falling apart ideologically. Okay, let's begin with the Haredi idea, okay, that Haredim are going to live, say, aloof from the general society, separate from the general society and independent of it. And because we are all living in a kind of Purim spiel where the only model we know is Judaism as a counterculture, right? That's what we got from 2,000 years of survival in the diaspora. Because that's the way we view the world, we're all in this Purim spiel. The Haredim in particular, well, they have to typecast the Chilonim in Israel as the Goyim, because in this Purim spiel, there's only a limited number of roles, and there are the Jews and there are the Goyim. Okay, now that ideology, the idea of the state as Maseh Satan, as the work of the devil and so forth, is falling apart. Okay, young Haredim are increasingly finding that an untenable ideology for several reasons. First of all, because it's clearly absurd. Secondly, because the whole purpose of it was to try to remain independent, right? Because those who live in a counterculture and there's a dominant culture need to remain independent of it in order to sustain their own culture. The problem is, of course, that if you don't participate, by the way, if anybody thinks I'm riffing against Haredim here, I'm not. I'm talking about the ideological point, not about the people, okay? Talk about the ideology. One of the consequences of trying to remain independent of the dominant culture is that your prospects for earning are more limited, and consequently, you become more dependent on the state. Okay, so it's undeniable that Haredim have become more dependent on the state as a result of widespread poverty. So that actually undermines the ideology itself. Okay, and I think that this is going to not only fall apart, but change for another reason. And that is that one of the main barriers to Haredi integration into general Israeli society is the inability to get a higher education. The reason that Haredim do not get a higher education is because higher education in this country is tied together, it's bound together with university culture. University culture is, in fact, hostile to Haredi values. However, because of technology, this is changing, okay? What's happening now is that courses, the kind of courses that a person needs in order to increase their productivity are becoming a commodity. You can just go online and watch the best course at MIT or the best course at any other university, and you don't need to be part of university culture because of an unbundling between university culture and higher education itself. The inability of Haredim, for reasons that they have chosen to get the kind of education that they need, is just becoming irrelevant. They are now able to get, they will soon be able to get that education without paying any price culturally. Okay, Chilonim also had an ideology. They wanted to build a socialist, secular, utopian state. Okay, I think that enough time has passed that it's quite clear that Israel is not going to survive as a Jewish state if it's a secular socialist state, and it's certainly not going to be a utopian state if it's a socialist state. So whereas Chilonim ideologically have traditionally regarded Judaism as a threat to the culture that they were trying to build, that is no longer the case because young people understand that without Jewish substance, the Jewish state is going to run out of steam. Nobody wants to be culturally rootless in their own state. And Chilonim are slowly abandoning an anti-Dati ideology, I think is more or less gone by now, and are looking for a kind of Judaism that they can live with. And we're going to talk about what that might be. Okay, religious Zionism is another ideology, okay? The Kuknik version of religious Zionism, for example, which regarded the state as Yesod Kisei Hashem B'olam, the foundation of God's seat in the world. Well, that's not very widely believed anymore. The religious Zionist view was that we used to live in kehilot, in the diaspora, that the kehilot didn't function very well, and as a consequence, what we need is for the state to become one giant kehilah to replace all of the other kehilot. And they wanted the state to use its power and its resources to protect and to promote Judaism. The problem with that, of course, is, as they have discovered, is that by putting religion in the hands of the state, you are handing the keys to religion precisely to the wrong people. And it's not what states do well, and Judaism is unlikely to benefit from that. The scale is wrong. Coerced religion fails. State rabbis have the wrong incentives because they're bureaucrats and they're second-guessed by secular courts. So the religious Zionist ideology is falling apart as well. Those who are confident that Judaism will become a mainstream culture, bottom up, don't need or want state coercion. So because of the fact that Judaism is becoming a mainstream default culture, all of the old ideologies are kind of beginning to sound very archaic. Okay, so if Judaism is becoming the default culture of the state, okay, it isn't going to matter how we got there. Okay, one of the, I listen to arguments, the standard arguments between Berdichevsky and Achad Ha'am and Herzl about whether the state should be cultural or should be political. All of these arguments don't matter. The one single fact that is relevant is that Judaism is becoming a default culture in the state of Israel. It's completely not path dependent, all right? It doesn't matter how we got there. Once we get there, that's the only fact that matters. And that is also going to be the main difference between Jewish life in Israel, eventually, and Jewish life abroad, always and everywhere, okay? Jewish life abroad will never, anywhere, be a default culture. It will always be a counterculture. In Israel, it's going to be the mainstream culture. Okay, but the question is, what would Judaism as a mainstream culture look like? We don't know. We haven't ever tried this before, at least not for the past 2,000 years. and it needs to evolve slowly. It's not the kind of thing where I can decide now where this process is going to end. We have to kind of go through the evolutionary process and see where it takes us. Okay, but there are two things that I know. First of all, it needs to scale, okay, because if it's a default culture, that means it's for everybody, not just for a small elite. And secondly, it needs to be adaptive because it needs to survive. Okay, so let's start with what this might look like. Let's first a comment about the state, and then afterwards comments about halakha itself. What is the true role of a Jewish state? People used to think, that the Jewish state was going to change the Jewish people. It was going to dictate some kind of culture, whether it was secular socialist or whether it was religious Zionist or whether. No, that's not the job of the state. The state is simply to provide a sense of home to the Jewish people so that they feel secure enough that they can themselves develop Judaism in a natural and organic way. Okay? The state does one thing. It provides a framework. It provides a miskeret. When Jews are confident, well, then they don't have to always be signaling their loyalty by doing weird things that only Jews do. They can actually focus on what's really important to them. That's the first thing. But in terms of halakha itself, if it's to be for everybody, not just for a religious minority, but a default culture for a country, well, let me try to use an intuition pump over here. There's a medrash, it's a Gemara in Yevamos. It says that in the time of Chizkiyahu, I'll read it first in the source, בדקו מקוות ועד אנטיפטרוס ולא מצאו תינוק ותינוקת איש ואישה שלא היו בקיאים בהלכות טומאה וטהרה. Okay? It says that in the time of Chizkiyahu, they checked in the entire land of Israel, and they didn't find a single man, woman, or child who was not expert in all the laws of ritual purity, of tumah v'tahara. Okay? Okay, I'm using this as an intuition pump. Let's now try to think what life is like in a society like that, where everybody knows all of halakha. Okay? Well, the first thing is that the idea of the Beis Medrash and of Rabbanim being somehow a detached elite, separate from the rest of society, which is the Litvish yeshiva model for the past 200 years, and which somehow has been adopted both by Haredim and by religious Zionists as kind of the model. It's probably not the way it looks when you have a Judaism that's really for everybody, right? That's for the entire society. It's unlikely. It's unlikely that you can have people deliberately talking in a private language so that other people don't understand, or thinking of halakha as some kind of idealized pie-in-the-sky talk that's completely unrelated to actual life if you live in a society where halakha is not restricted to a small elite that lives around the Beis Medrash. The average person in a society like this will live halakha simply as the most natural way of life, as a matter of course, not as an ideology. If the whole society is that way, it's not an ideological statement. It's just the way we live, the way anybody lives their own culture in a natural way. And third of all, halakha has to be simple and intuitive if everybody's going to do it. Here's my guess, okay? If every man, woman, and child in Israel in the time of Chizkiyahu knew the laws of tumah v'tahara, they weren't arguing about Reb Chaim Brisker's chidushim on the Rambam, or they weren't arguing Shev Shmaitza. There was probably a very simple and straightforward halakha that every man, woman, and child could understand. It was probably simple and intuitive, and not baroque and full of counterintuitive signals. Now, just to give you an analogy, okay, if you think about language and halakha is my favorite analogy, but languages generally get more complex with time, okay? more exceptions work their way in, words start to take on new meanings, and languages in general get more and more complex. However, there are moments when languages get simpler, okay? Languages get simpler when lots of people who are not native speakers of that language suddenly begin to speak that language, okay? So if you get a lot of immigration, a lot of people, right, from countries with other, with, you know, where people speak other languages, you will find that the language gets simpler. So if in fact Judaism leaves the Beis Medrash, leaves the small religious minority that observes it, and becomes the Judaism of the masses, it will inevitably become simpler and more intuitive. Nevertheless, having said that, I don't want to suggest that the point is to just water it down to nothing because we want to pander to people who have values that come from outside, and we want to make everybody feel comfortable, so let's pander. So let me just say, first of all, that whatever halakha becomes, simpler and more intuitive, nevertheless, it still has to be substantive enough that it shapes people's consciousness, okay? Jewish attitudes are way more subtle than specific halachot, okay? Jews have attitudes towards things. Those attitudes are essentially embedded in the halachot, okay? If you dilute halakha too much, then those attitudes will actually fall apart as well. So it needs to be sufficiently substantive. And people need to be knowledgeable enough, okay? If you have a society of people who don't know their own culture well enough, then they're not going to be able to identify and resist outside influence because they won't even know when something is outside influence. You need to be knowledgeable enough to recognize when something is an outside influence. Okay, so in sum, what I'm saying here is that halakha will probably, in order to survive in a society in which the vast majority of people want to participate in it in some manner or form, it's going to need to evolve to that sweet spot in between being too thick and too thin. Something that permits some kind of emotional resonance, right? Where it has to speak to people. It has to appeal to human intuitions, at least human intuitions that have been adequately disciplined. Okay? So I just, as an aside, I want to say that as we limp towards this, okay, we're kind of moving in this direction, but in fits, I would say. If you look at Datiyei Aretzef, which generally, right, those people who are mostly kids from Dati homes who've kind of drifted off, but also in the other direction, people who are finding some kind of vast continuum between being religious and not religious, I want to put a positive spin on this. I think that this is simply a matter of people looking for a Judaism that scales, right? A Judaism that really is for everybody. I'm not endorsing any particular version of it that you might see now because, as I said, these are kind of inchoate, very, early efforts at something. What I think is positive about it is that it's an effort to do what I think is inevitable, which is namely to find a version of halakha that scales to the entire nation. Okay, there's a danger to all this. I'm saying all this in a positive way, but let me just say that there's a risk, okay? What I'm suggesting is that Judaism is going to just become a mainstream culture, right? Well, there are a lot of mainstream cultures in the world, right? The people who've lived their religious lives as a mainstream culture are familiar to us. They have a name. We call them goyim, okay? And that's probably not what we want to become, right? If you look at the way Scandinavians celebrate their Christianity, for example, right? You say, yeah, that's probably not what we had in mind, okay? We don't want to become lazy or indifferent to our religion. So I'm suggesting here that inevitably it's going to become a mainstream culture, but there are risks to this process, okay? I'm not suggesting otherwise. Okay, let's talk a little bit about technology. Okay, the problem with technology is mostly about automation, okay? I mentioned before energy and information. Yeah, okay, if we get more efficient energy, I don't think any tragedy is going to come of it. I mean, maybe, but that's probably not where we should be looking for problems. or faster communication. I mean, essentially now we have extremely efficient energy production. We have essentially immediate transfer of huge amounts of information. That's not what I'm worried about. It's automation that's the problem, okay? Automation breaks halacha's underlying model of the world. All right, let me tell you what I mean. First of all, what happens when automation reaches a certain limit is that there's an unbundling, I like that word, of actions and consequences, okay? What we're used to is that in order to get a certain consequence, you have to take a certain action, right? If you want your car to move, you need to drive it, all right? So that when halacha says that a certain act is forbidden, what you take for granted is that a certain consequence is also being forbidden. The things go together, right? But what happens when these two things are separated out? Okay, so let's start with something simple, self-driving cars on Shabbos, all right? All right, well, supposing I could just go out of my house and summon a car, and it's just gonna show up, the door will open automatically, I'll just get in. Let's assume that my getting into the car has absolutely no consequences whatsoever. At a certain time, the door is closed, et cetera, and the car goes off, okay? So it sounds like that might be okay, but then you would say, yeah, but you still had to take some action. You know, you had to suggest that the car should come. Well, maybe that's enough of an action, right? So that you couldn't get the consequence without taking action. If we can cut you off at the action, then we'll also cut off the consequence, all right? Okay, I had a student, a doctoral student, who did his PhD thesis on the following. He put people into fMRI machines, and he had them think. Okay, so they would see in front of them a maze, right, or a map, and they would think about where they wanted to go on the map, right? Left turn, right turn, they literally didn't move a muscle, okay? The fMRI machine was able to see the voxels light up in their brain, and it would actually do exactly what he was thinking, okay? Well, that's not so far off. It's not as far off as you think. Presumably, we're not going to stick people into fMRI machines, but there'll be some technology in which brain reading is going to be feasible at some pragmatic way, okay? What's going to happen if all you need to do is think and stuff is going to happen, right? Every single thing that you're not supposed to be doing on Shabbos is going to happen simply because you thought about it. All right? What are you going to do then? Now, again, I don't want to deal with the technical question, but the point is that by and large, the problem here is that either, it depends on how we're going to resolve these questions, either Shabbat is going to become completely oppressive because the world is going to be filled with sensors and everything we do is going to make something happen, right? And if we say that you can't do that, well, then it'll be impossible to live. And if we say, yeah, well, it's okay, yeah, none of that stuff matters because you didn't actually do anything, then Shabbat kind of becomes a little bit thin, right? So the question is there somewhere between too oppressive and too permissive? I just want to mention here that for those who are into this, this is an aside, but Rav Asher Weiss, the Minchas Asher, wrote about this, and he said that we should regard all of these kinds of things as relevant to a particular melacha on Shabbat of makeh b'patish. Makeh b'patish is a very different kind of one of the 39 melachot that you're not allowed to do. It's unusual in the sense that the very definition of it depends on your intention. And because the definition of it depends on your intention, he was able to parse it out so that, well, if you do things deliberately, then it's not okay. But if you do things in a passive way, even if you know they're going to happen, even if they're inevitable, then it's okay. All right. So you can see that he's thinking ahead over here, right? He's trying to figure out some way that we can split this so that it might work. But again, that was an aside. But here's the thing that I'm really worried about. Okay. All right. If most of Shabbat becomes irrelevant, most of the things that are forbidden because they're just going to happen when we need them to happen by themselves, right? Well, let's think about other stuff. What about kashrut? I think soon we're probably all going to be eating synthetic meat, okay? My guess is that once synthetic meat becomes as good as meat, and it's completely convincing, people who continue to eat meat at that point are going to be regarded as people like people who own slaves, okay? It's just going to become the kind of thing that nobody's going to, it's not going to be done in society. Okay, well, once you take meat out of our diet, there's just no meat in the world, okay? Only synthetic meat, but there's no real meat. Most of kashrus doesn't matter anymore, okay? And now, if I can take this a little bit further, reproductive technology is really advancing very, very quickly. Okay, the idea of a menstrual cycle might become completely irrelevant at some point because reproduction won't depend on it in any meaningful way, and there'll be technological ways to make it stop, okay? Okay, so there won't be, Shabbat becomes very thin, Kashrut becomes very thin, Taharat HaMishpacha becomes very thin, all right? Okay, now you might say, big deal. I mean, all right, so we've eliminated slavery. There's all kinds of halachot about slavery. We don't have korbanot. Okay, there's whole books about korbanot. So big deal. So there won't be kashrut, taharat mishpacha, and Shabbat. The problem is that doesn't leave enough. Okay, I mean the idea is that once there wasn't a Beit HaMikdash and there weren't korbanot, we kind of made up for it with making halacha much more complicated in other places, right? What happens when all of these things start to become too thin, okay? Okay, something to think about. All right, something else. I'm going to go through this one fast. The need for people to actually engage in constructive activity to survive, okay? All right, we've advanced a long way since cavemen, but nevertheless, people still kind of need to go to work to survive, for the most part, okay? But what happens when robots do most of the work, so most people don't need to be employed to get stuff done. When food and shelter are abundant and cheap, okay, and we're living on UBI, on Universal Basic Income, okay, what happens then? Okay, are we going to become, I mean, to put it crudely, are we just all going to become beach bums? Are we going to just become, you know, like middle-aged white males in middle America, just addicted to opioids and collecting, you know, or are we going to all be learning in kollel, right? I mean, it would be nice to think that the kollel, you know, like got there first, and here's a great idea. Jews could just sit and study. That's the dream, right? But the question is, does that really scale up? It might. I don't know. But this could lead to an existential crisis, or there could be some kind of compensatory mechanism. I'm not quite sure what's going to happen. Okay, and finally, third thing that technology is going to change is the democratization of Torah. Automated tools, all right? Let me just tell you what's already going on in the labs, all right? Already now, you'll be able, pretty soon, okay, to take any book, any Jewish book that was ever printed, okay, and at the touch of a button, see it, first of all, in any font you want. It'll be digitized, okay? It will have, if you look at it, you know, the classic Jewish books, right? So they're in ugly fonts. There are all kinds of mistakes in it because the printer made a mistake, or the scribe made a mistake, or the OCR guy made a mistake, right? And there's no vocalization. There's no punctuation, right? Nikud. There's no punctuation. The sources aren't identified. Already now, you can pretty much get any book vocalized with punctuation put in, with all the abbreviations opened up, with the text corrected, and with all the sources identified, okay? And all this basically using, all right, just a little aside, for the techie people, if you take BERT, okay, and just apply, BERT is some technology invented at Google where the core of it is you use large corpora of texts, of billions of words, many billions, and you're able to use it in order to guess what a masked word is in a text, okay? Once you're able to do that trick, okay, once you can do that trick, you can do all of this stuff, okay? And all of this is already, it all already exists in labs. You could do that. Well, what does that mean? That means that Torah is very quickly going to be democratized. Basically, everybody will have access to everything in a way that's actually, right, that is accessible, that you don't need experts. Now, what you also are going to have, and this is a little bit further away, is summaries. You give it a topic, right? Some sugya, some topic that you're interested in, and say, give me a summary. And you will be able to get an extremely reasonable summary of that halachic topic, all right? That doesn't quite exist yet, and I want to make a distinction between, say, a topic where it's more or less, well known what to do. In other words, Kli Sheni on Shabbos Mavashel Kalei Habishal, for those who know, right? So that's a standard kind of question. It's simply a matter of looking up the literature, putting it all together, trying to understand what the background issues are, what the main commentators are, and getting a reasonable summary. That is soon going to be available, okay? When the question is, okay, I have the following very personal halachic question, right? Yeah, so that requires common sense, that requires understanding human nature, that's further off, okay? But one can imagine such a thing happening as well, all right? So here's my question. Let's say we get to that stage, okay? Everybody has access to every book. Well, is this going to spread Torah far and wide, allow people to, focus on deeper ideas rather than on working their way through a difficult text, but to focus on the really deep ideas? That's the positive way of looking at it. Or, on the contrary, is it going to break the Masorah, where the whole idea that somebody needs to learn from a teacher because there's a lot going on that's not in the text, right? Torah is supposed to be oral law. It's supposed to come with, a whole lot that you can't write down. When you watch how people act and you learn from a teacher, from a mentor, well, you pick up a whole lot that's just not in the book, right? Are we going to lose that because we make things too accessible to people? Or even worse, are we going to weaken people's engagement with halakha itself? And let me tell you, there are two reasons why I fear that we might weaken people's engagement, okay? One is, you can replace recall with retrieval. I mean, there's really no reason for me to actually remember all this stuff if all I need to do is ask the question and get the information, right? So it could be that retrieval is not going to be a tool that enhances recall, but rather it's going to be a tool that replaces recall, okay? It might become, if I may take an analogy, people's sense of direction atrophies when they use Waze, okay? I used to know my way around Yerushalayim. I could get from anywhere to anywhere, right? Because I just knew what to do, except that they changed the one-way streets, every couple of months. But other than that, I was always able to do this, right? I can't drive 2 blocks now without Waze, all right? I just get lost, right? That's because I'm not using that part of my brain anymore, and it's just begun to atrophy. Is the same thing going to happen with halakha? And then the other thing that I worry about is if we think of halakha as a bunch of leaves rather than think about the whole tree that generates it, okay? The way it works, if you think about how Shabbat works, there are basic principles. From those principles, certain details follow. From those details, more details follow, etc., right? Now, if all you know about Hilchot Shabbat is because you opened up, say, Shmirat Shabbat ki Hilchata, and I don't want to say anything bad about it because it's a wonderful work, but the fact of the matter is it only deals with the leaves, okay? You don't see anything of the structure of it. You could learn all of it and not understand Hilchot Shabbat at all, not know what the 39 forbidden malachot on Shabbat are, okay? You would have no idea of the structure of Hilchot Shabbat and what follows from what. You would just know in any given situation, can I put my tea bag in the thing? That you would know. But that would give you absolutely no intuition. And not only would it give you no intuition, but it doesn't allow you to engage at all with the content, okay? It's alienating. And I fear that all of this technology might lead us to a point where halakha just seems arbitrary and doesn't have any kind of emotional resonance. All right, so let me conclude here. I think that because of statehood and because of Judaism becoming a default culture and because of increased trust among people and decreased signaling is a topic I love, but I'm not going to get into it. Just what it means is we do weird stuff, because only by doing weird stuff do we prove to each other that we're actually loyal to the system, okay? If you wear a shtreimel in the summer in Tel Aviv, everybody knows that you are loyal to the home team, okay? That's called signaling. That's its purpose, okay? Now, if we can actually lower the need for signaling because people have more trust, because there's less tension within society, because there is some kind of default culture, some form of Judaism that people kind of take for granted, then that is likely to raise the emotional resonance of halakha as it's practiced. On the other hand, technology might make halakha, might make it more widespread and more democratic and allow people to think about it in deeper and more interesting ways, but it also might make it more formal and technocratic, and if it does, then it would lower the emotional resonance of halakha. And I don't know how these things are going to interact with each other. Okay. That's what I have to say. Let me just get back to end with Jeremy. All of the above, all of the stuff that I talked about now were things that interested him very, very much. Jeremy was very interested in Jewish thought. He was very interested in halakha in particular. He was interested and an expert in technology. He was very loyal to the state of Israel and served for 3 years in the army. It was Jeremy's loss was a tragic personal loss for his family, for his friends, for all of us. But he was part of something much bigger than himself. He came to be part of society in Israel that's evolving and growing in ways that he wanted and in ways that he was very much part of. And this process is going to continue after him, and it's going to continue after all of us. Berega katon azavtich uberachamim gdolim akaptzech. Thank you. Okay, if anybody has questions, I'm happy to answer. Yeah. Susan, you.
You talked about the Judaism becoming a default culture. That's I think a little optimistic. I mean, we have, not because of the election tomorrow, but we have Merev Michaeli begging to make transportation allowed on Shabbat. Begging. And she said, and if I do it, it can never be undone. And you have the people traveling to Greece to get married and laws.
I got it. Okay. You don't need to go through the whole list. Okay. All right, so let me just say something about that. Again, you made it difficult for me not to talk about the elections tomorrow, but I'm not going down that path. I just want to say the following. Here's where you could see a change, all right? I'm making a claim about something that I think is already happening and that I think that is going to continue to happen, and that we're going to see this if we're alive in another 25 or 50 years, okay? But let me tell you what you could see already. When I came to Israel in 1980, you had to choose a team, all right? There was the Chiloni team, and if you were on the Chiloni team, you had to have certain opinions, okay? And I can just give you the checklist, okay? These were the things that you needed to believe. There was the religious Zionist team, and if you were on that team, these were the things that you had to believe, okay? And if you were on the Haredi team, that was, okay? So there were just 3 boxes. There were Masortiim also, okay? And then there was some outliers. There's always, some outliers. But basically, you had these boxes, and you needed to pick your box, and you were in it, okay? Now, what happened since then is those boxes have completely busted open, okay? And what you have now is some kind of a normal distribution, right? Where the middle is kind of the middle, right? And that may not be where the middle is going to be in another 25, 50 years, and it's not a perfectly normal distribution now because this is part of a process. But the reason that it seems to you that things are getting worse is that when people are in boxes, well, those are the things that you hear. You hear the mainstream Haredim, and you hear the mainstream religious Zionists, okay? And you hear the mainstream Haredim, right? That's what, Chilonim, right? That's what you hear, okay? But when you have a normal distribution, you know what you hear? You hear those long tails because they're the ones who make a lot of noise, okay? The long tails are, in fact, more extreme than any of the boxes that existed back then. But they're just long tails, all right? They're not the mainstream. Yeah.
You spoke about the thinning out of Shabbat and Kashrut and Torah Mishpacha
Right.
related to automation not exilic, they are still within a certain category of Shulchan Aruch, which has elements of exile in what's included and not included in Shulchan Aruch. And we didn't touch the issue of the notion of virtue as an expression of halacha in ways we may not even know about that might require a state of Israel to allow that to use Israel in ways we don't even aware of it. And I don't know how automation doesn't relate to that.
Yeah, okay, first of all, regardless, call me old-fashioned, but somehow to me it seems like Shabbat and Kashrut and Tarat and Mishpacha are pretty fundamental. If we lose that, we've lost something big, okay? It's not like, there's other sifim in the Shulchan Aruch, right? Simanim in the Shulchan Aruch, okay, yeah. So yeah, but virtue in Judaism is embedded in halakha. It's not like, there's a lot of things that say, be nice, right? But for the most part, we've never been good at leaving be nice at be nice. We're mostly like, be nice in the following 37 very, very specific ways. But as I said, I don't know what's going to happen. Maybe some stuff that's very, very specific is going to become more generic because it just be nice, but I don't know. As I said, all I'm saying is that we're in the middle of a process and I kind of have a sense for its general direction, but I don't want to take a guess at any of the specifics. Yeah.
We've been in a democratization situation before in our lives, and also schools. That is when publishing books first previous to books being published required recall. And there was, manuscripts, but there were very few of them, and they, you had one Haggadah for every show or that sort of stuff. And then you spend publishing it. And all of a sudden, an awful lot more people had access to world this information from Jews and none. And we learned how to do that, and we learned how to stay Jewish. And I can even go further back in that, and then as you pointed out, when we ceased to be in Israel, we had to figure out how to do and how to stay Jews. And so I go on faith in our ability to figure it out. We will not be what we know today, any more than Shabbat of 2,000 years ago.
Yeah, okay, so I just, in case it wasn't clear, I am mostly confident as well, as you are. I think we will adapt, okay? The title of my talk was, Can Judaism Adapt? The short answer is yes, okay? But I'm simply pointing out that there are challenges here. We might have to deal with some difficulties. But yes, and I think ultimately, yeah. Okay, yeah.
For the sake of argument, you seem to have positioned the simple and the intuitive versus the brisker rub on the Rambam.
I was hoping you wouldn't pick up on that. I thought I'd slide it in, and
But I'm delighted that you did.
yeah.
Can we infer from this that maybe we should keep our eyes on the Sephardim?
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you for asking that. So I always get, whenever I talk about, Judaism becoming, what? Yeah, the question was, when I talk about Judaism becoming more intuitive, do I mean like Sephardim? Okay. Yeah, so that was a very good question. I always get asked that question. So the answer is to some extent, yes. There's a lot of ways that Judaism can become more intuitive and more popular and less elitist and et cetera, all of which is already true, right, for Sephardim, and I greatly admire them for that. But it can become more simple and intuitive and amami in other ways as well. That's not the only model for it, but it's certainly a model. So I'm grateful that you brought it up, and I should have brought it up myself, because it's absolutely true. Yeah.
On the topic of preserving Judaism in the age of technology, I'm very passionate about blockchain technology because it offers these decentralized, permanent, and immutable digital ledgers. And insofar as that is true, which it is not fully, but that value proposition is very possible, what do you think the value of preserving Judaism on the blockchain?
Can you explain this?
Yeah. All right. There's a little bit of a niche issue here, but Bitcoin. You know about Bitcoin? Oh, okay. Well, anyway, here's the thing. You can preserve information in a distributed way. Okay, that's the important point of blockchain. Okay, and he's suggesting that maybe we should be preserving Judaism in some distributed way. I could see that there might be some value to that. I mean, let's not make too big a deal out of it, okay? Because most people want to be able to access that stuff, in some easy way, right? The fact that it's distributed out there means, yeah, it might be in a capsule for 1 billion years, but I'm not sure that it's necessarily going to help me tomorrow morning. But yeah.
It's actually right in our phones.
Yeah.
Crypto wallets are evolving to the point.
Yeah, let's not do an ad now for Ethereum, okay? I know where you're going with this.
It's not for Ethereum, actually.
I get you, man. Well, I'll take it offline. Okay. Yeah.
So most of what you're suggesting is effectively a diffusion process, that the whole time is going to tend towards a happy, maybe unhappy medium where religion is just strong enough that everybody's able to accept it, becomes the mainstream culture. But you've also mentioned, of course, that communication worldwide has become very fast, very frictionless. What creates borders at the edge of the country that keeps you have been separated from the mainstream conscious culture?
No, yeah, that's a good question. No, yeah.
One of the questions as they're asked.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Okay. This is a physics guy, right? Computers, all right, whatever. Okay, so it was kind of worded in a way that maybe not everybody in this room would, but here's the point. I'll say it over in my words, okay? The idea is that I'm saying that culture is going to spread, right? Some version of Judaism, which is yet unclear, is going to evolve and diffuse, okay? Now, the question is, if I think that diffusion is going to become so simple that Judaism has just kind of spread its way around in some almost uniform way, right? Well, why shouldn't the same thing happen in the other direction, namely that the world culture, whatever that might be, is going to diffuse its way right into Israel and just dilute everything, right? Is that the question? Yeah, that's a good question. I hope that doesn't happen. Yeah. Right, yeah, fair enough. Right. That way we can. That's a good point. They said that's a very nice point. I buy that. Okay, Judaism becomes a mainstream culture in Israel, but Israel becomes the world counterculture. Okay, I like that. That's cool. That's a perfect analogy. Okay,
We're
yeah.
going to take one more question.
Lisa, take over.
No, we're going to take one more question, and then we'll have schmooze time outside.
So you were talking about the asymptotes, that technology is approaching some kind of asymptote. Isn't it possible that, because of some ways in which we don't fully understand the technology, that we're actually closer to the asymptote now than we think, and it's not going to advance the way you think it is, and we won't have to deal with any of this stuff?
That when you, let's say, yeah. All right. The point is that I suggested that maybe technology is approaching some kind of a limit, right? So you say, well, maybe we're so close to the limit already that all of the things I'm worried about are not going to happen. No, bear in mind that when the gap between where you are and that limit gets cut in half and you're very close to it, it's in absolute terms an extremely small change, right? But the way that you experience it, right, is as an exponential change because the gap is now cut in half, okay? Each one of these very small changes is going to be experienced humongously. All I can tell you is that just play around with Stable Diffusion and GPT-3, okay? And if you're not freaked out, okay, then we'll talk. There's freaky stuff happening now, okay? It's just freaky.
Okay. Wow. Thank you so much. For those of you that missed this lesson after this, you can sign up. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Sometimes feels like Jeremy was just here yesterday, and other times feels like it's been forever. really been consistent is you guys. And there is no way to ever express how much it means to me, and to our family, how diligently so many of you were at keeping in touch with us and caring about us and being involved in our lives. And that's what it's really all about, with all due respect to all your technology stuff. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming. Have a good vacation day tomorrow. We can all go to the beach, maybe. Those that do want to dive in Mariv, it's going to be over here. The rest of us are going to be hanging out outside. Thank you again.
Thanks, Lisa.